Okay, we are recording now. This is April Grayson here with Mr. Ben Cole and Mr. Victor McTeer via Zoom on May 21st, 2021. And we are in 3 separate locations due to pandemic situations and geography distance, but we're on Zoom together today for an oral history interview with Mr. Victor McTeer, with a focus on his time at North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. So thank you both, and Mr. McTeer, thank you especially. And I just want to start us off with a question. If you could give your full name, and if you don't mind giving your date of birth, place of birth, and a little bit of background about your childhood, if you don't mind.
My name is Charles Victor McTeer. My date of birth is September the 25th, 1948. I was born and raised in Baltimore, Maryland. And I was a lawyer in Mississippi for 40 years until I retired back in 2005. And I originally came to Mississippi as a civil rights worker in 1969 and worked at Freedom Village, a group sponsored in Washington County, Mississippi by the Delta Ministry and former members of SNCC and COFA.
Thank you so much. And we will want to ask you definitely questions about that time, but I wondered if you could take us back a little further and talk, if you don't mind, about your growing up in Baltimore. Who were your family, your parents, and what was your childhood like in Baltimore?
Wow. I was orphaned as a kid. My mother died having me. And so as a consequence, I was raised ultimately after my father died by 2 older women, one of whom was my great aunt. And I lived in the Northwest Baltimore community as a kid. That was the foundation for the movie or the show, The Wire. That was where I was born and raised. And subsequently, I attended public schools in Baltimore, and I received a scholarship to attend Western Maryland College in Westminster, Maryland, where I became one of the first 2 African Americans to graduate from that school 4 years later in 1969. During that period of time, I got involved in any number of social justice movements, including a campus Peace Corps that took me on adventures to Puerto Rico, working with sugar workers, Panther, West Virginia, working with coal miners. I got my own job at Newark, New Jersey, working with the Newark Housing Authority, cataloging the struggles of poor people in public housing. And the last place I went to was Greenville, Mississippi. And one of my mothers was a nurse. The other one was a public school teacher, a kindergarten teacher. And they had an interesting view of life, particularly in view of the fact that most, from what I gather, people were kind of amazed that 2 older Black women would choose to raise a orphan child from infancy. And, there are people who took the position that 2 women couldn't do that. And so they had a special kind of largesse, special kind of forcefulness, determination that they were going to show that they could do it. And so they got help from almost everybody I can think of in the neighborhood. There was no family that I didn't know, that I didn't live in their house, and their fathers were helping me do this and that and everything. I was like the neighborhood kid. And the only thing that really got everybody upset was when I decided after 4 years on the Hill at McDaniel, Western Maryland College, going through all the situations that I went through, that I was ready for the big leagues of racism. I wanted to go to Mississippi.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Would you like to speak the names of your parents as well as your mothers, your two mothers that you mentioned?
Sure. My father and mother were Charles Jackson and say what? And Minuet McTeer. And Charles Jackson McTeer came from a very, very Southern Richmond, Virginia field hand background. And Minuet was high school educated, and she got her first job working at the Pentagon as one of the few Black women who was a secretary there. So I come from a mixed marriage, Northern and Southern, one Baltimore, one, from the fields, and very, very devoted to each other. When my mother died, my father was sort of left. Are you there? Can you hear me?
Yes.
All
Yes.
right. I am seeing that Willie Bailey, I think, is trying to get in.
Let me check the.
Yeah, I don't see him coming on at this point. He hasn't actually gotten on at this point.
Okay. Well, let's continue on and we'll see if we can hook up with him.
Okay.
I was an orphan for a period of time. My father was still driving trucks at that juncture, and I would stay with my great aunt, Miss Pettigrew, and her longtime friend, Evangeline P. Mitchell. And then when he ultimately died, about 3 years later, my father, that is, the decision was made that I would be adopted by them, and that's how I got adopted.
And you said Miss Pettigrew and Evangeline Mitchell.
Mm-hmm.
Those were the names.
That's the names.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Feel free to share about, the anything up to the point of Greenville, Mississippi, but could you share a little bit more about what brought you to Greenville and what you did when you first arrived?
The group that I was attached to in Mississippi, in Maryland at McDaniel College was called the Student Opportunity Service. It was a Peace Corps type organization that engaged in social justice activities, which is what we call it now. And it was led by two professors at the school. One of them was a guy named Ira Zepp, who became a close mentor and friend. And Zepp had a long history in the civil rights movement. He marched with the folk across the Edmund Pettus Bridge and was very familiar with Mr. King, and actually wrote a book about Mr. King's writings and his theology. He was the person that helped me become involved and started me off tutoring Black kids in Westminster, Maryland, learning how to read. It's kind of unusual because my family, particularly the two ladies that raised me, are always involved in activities pertaining to feeding Black folk. Miss Caswell Mitchell, she was a kindergarten teacher in South Baltimore, which is a very poverty-stricken part of our community. We lived in the Northwest, which is considered a very middle-class community. And the result was that we were always doing drives for this or drives for that, or trying to raise money to feed people, or clothing drives and things of this nature. And so I was eager, particularly with some of the problems that I had being 16 years old and one of two Blacks on a predominantly, all white campus. And with the isolation and some of the things that are rather negative led me to conclude that I really wanted to spend more time in activities that were beneficial to the Black community and the poor people. And so that led me to all the places that I traveled to under Mr. Zepp's tutelage, along with other students, to get a chance for the first time in my life to see poverty as I'd never seen it before and recognize it as a systemic, evident, avoidable situation if only America had any commitment towards justice and fairness.
Thank you. So could you talk about maybe your first year in Greenville and what you did and what your thoughts were about being in Mississippi?
When I arrived in Greenville in 1969, the summer of 1969, I didn't have a clue at the time of what I was walking into. I thought endemic racism was the extent of the insult-laden, demeaning stigmatization that often befits the treatment that Blacks receive in predominantly white situations when you're one of a few among many. And I had learned how to handle that pretty well. It was, you couldn't walk around in anonymity, because you were, one or the other one, and it was insulting, demeaning to say the least, but nonetheless, you learn how to deal with it. When I went to Mississippi, for the first time, it became very evident that your life was at stake. In the Mississippi Delta, there were some things that were not tolerated. And there were some things that people talked about quietly. And for the first time ever, I really felt that my life was at stake and that I didn't know what I was doing or what I was walking into. And then to make it even worse, I had that kind of Northern bias, which people of color and white people from the North often have about Southerners. And more than a few people caught on to it very quickly. And so as a consequence, I had to have a coming of age, come to Jesus moment on more than one occasion. And it was at that point in time that I really began to understand when I would see poor Black folk particularly, that there was real meaning to that old homily, but for the grace of God, there go I. Some of the most brilliant people that I met, I found and discovered for myself in the Delta. And I was just absolutely stunned that people that I had known from the South who lived in Baltimore, I began to recall my wife's father, for example, who was from North Carolina and started out at a large corporation as a janitor, and then became a cab driver, and then married his wife and brought her up to Baltimore, and then eventually ended up doing math work in the space program through a training program. I realized how much I underestimated the very people that I claimed to love so much. And it was a remarkable experience because every day in Mississippi, you would see people who were facing incredible problems with not only courage, but with creativity that was absolutely marvelous. You do what you can with what you got. And that was a major principle in my life and the women who raised me, who would seek every bit of help to try to raise this oversized kid, be a man when people said they couldn't do it. So by the end of that first summer in Mississippi, the year after the summer I graduated, spending 6 weeks in Mississippi, I was convinced this was the place where I needed to be. And fortunately, there were some people in Mississippi, former SNCC workers and COFO workers, people with the Delta ministry who thought I was a good fit. And they recommended that I go to the Civil Rights Law School, which was Rutgers. in Newark, New Jersey. And they made a few calls, and I never saw anything like it. I'd already been accepted into Duke Law School. When I made my application to Rutgers, in 2 weeks I was accepted. And that showed me the power that these people who formerly were with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party had among Northerners who were willing to take them at face value and on merit and on the basis of the same brilliance that those folk had shown to those folk up north, that I had the credibility to get accepted into law school.
May I ask who some of those people were?
Most important of them, and when I say important, the one who persuaded me that I needed to come was a guy named Larry Guillotte. And Guillotte was he was the executive director, if you will, of Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party back in 64 or so. This is long before my time. And my last day in that first summer in Mississippi, we went to Mound Bayou, which I had never heard of before when I first came to Mississippi, but I kept hearing stories about it over and over and over again. And Mound Bayou, at the time, was the largest town and the oldest town founded by formerly enslaved people in the United States. And it's a marvelous story of how they managed to get a government charter, a state charter, and managed to put together a colony of 600 folk back in, I guess it had been 1887, to formulate their own community and succeed in giving it and keeping it alive. The speaker for Founders Day was Larry Guillotte, and I was introduced to him as this crazy kid from Baltimore who wanted to come back to Mississippi to stay. And a lot of people didn't believe it was possible because the former tour of duty, if you will, in Mississippi was you would come down, spend enough time to, learn a little bit about the state, and then go write your book and leave. And a lot of people didn't feel that. They didn't care for it. And so you were constantly told, when are you leaving to write your book? That kind of thing. And it wasn't my intent to do that. And I had to demonstrate that I was worth their time because I wasn't here to learn how to write a book and then to write about my experiences. I felt that my duty was to become a part of the community, live in the community, and learn from them, learn from all of them. I never wanted to be poor, but I wanted to be led by the poor. And I really felt that I had that opportunity, and going to law school was the first step in that direction. They set forth the path. They told me who to talk to. At Rutgers, I talked to them. Larry Guillotte, I talked to them. Next thing I know, I'm in law school.
So could you talk a little bit about your law school time and then what you did after that once you graduated?
I hated law school. I absolutely abhorred it. It was not what I thought it was going to be. And somehow or another, I had this magic design that, I would go there and 2 weeks later, I would be ready to go fight the good fight. And Larry and his wife, Monica, convinced me that I should not quit, but that I should try to meet another lawyer, a lawyer who they respected immensely. His name was Morton Stavis. And he was in Newark, New Jersey, where Rutgers was. And that I should try to, see if I could work with him, that he was still doing civil rights work, and he had worked with MFDP, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, along with Bill Kunstler and Arthur Kanoy and other lawyers from around the country during the 1964 Democratic National Convention, and likewise the Mississippi Challenge of 1964, 65. And they just felt very highly of him, and I met him. And then we had this remarkable event where, you know, as a first-year law student, you're not worth too much to any lawyer, especially one as valuable and as talented as Mort Davis was. But I begged for the job and told him that I realized it when I got to his office. I'd never met a lawyer before. And I wanted to be one. I just never had met one. And he was enlightening, and he was very, very fatherly. We became very close eventually over time, but he accepted me at what I said, and he gave me a position. Actually, he didn't give me a position. He let me come in his office on a temporary basis, which I did every day. And then in the middle of my second semester, he paid me that huge salary of $50 a month. And that's how I became Davis's law clerk. Every summer, I would come back to Mississippi. And I spent summers in Mount Bayou. I spent a summer in Jackson, working with the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee with a guy named Armin Durfner, who's a wonderful lawyer. And then the last summer, I kept a promise to my mothers, went back home to Baltimore, took the bar exam, told them that I wasn't going to come back to Baltimore and was not going to take the jobs that were offered to me there. And told them that Dee Dee, a young woman that I've known since I was 11 years old, she was one of the only persons that thought it was a great idea to go to Mississippi. And I asked her, would she come with me and marry me? And she said yes. And so I told my mother that 2 days after the wedding, we were leaving and moving to Mississippi. That went over real big. But we did. And only thing we promised was that we would be back in 2 years, take the jobs that we had. Dee Dee gave up a job in order to move to Mississippi. She was already a school teacher. But the long and short of it was that once we got to Mississippi, you know, we were just embraced by a community of people in Mount Bayou where we lived and elsewhere around the Delta who really took care of us and who really helped us survive. And, you know, 40 years later, we decided finally to retire and leave.
Thank you. I wanted to let you know that I did hear back from I didn't hear back from Mr. Bailey. The email bounced back to me as not being a valid address. So that didn't go through. And also I'm going to admit Mr. Roy DeBerry, who is also part of this oral history team, and he's going to join us now.
Let me see if I can call Willie, okay?
Okay.
And
I'm going to pause. I'll pause the recording real quickly then.
All right.
Okay, we are recording again, and we will be joined by Mr. Willie Bailey in a moment. But for in the interim, you have really shared about the community and its welcome and your decision to move to Mississippi. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the legal work that you were doing in Mississippi in the earlier days.
Well, I had interesting experience in terms of the very first case. You got to understand that the one thing that I didn't know at the time that I started this adventure in Mississippi is I didn't know the how-to of practicing law. And I was supposedly a private attorney. I didn't know how to price a divorce. You know, I didn't know how to figure out what my time was worth. I had no idea whatsoever about the cost and expenses that would arise. I didn't know you needed a secretary, not just to sit out there and look real funny and wave at people, but, they actually had to do something, and I didn't know how to type, and I didn't think that I needed to. So when a woman has heard that there's a lawyer in Mound Bayou who can help her with something that nobody else can help her with, and she comes in and tells you that she got fired from her job because when she was 17 years old, she had a baby out of wedlock, and you're pissed off. Ben will tell you this. I mean, it's visceral. You cannot run away from stuff like this, and I'm going to sue that son of a bitch. How? What are you supposed to do? And there's nobody there. You got to remember, we're all young lawyers. I knew who Johnny Walls was. I knew who Willie Bailey was. I knew who Tom Morris was, who were all lawyers who were at legal services. And we had all met and talked over time. But there was nobody to turn to and say, what do we do? And the only people I knew were the folk up in New York. And I was a clerk. It wasn't my job to file the lawsuit or how to do it. Nothing was clicking. And it's disgustingly futile. And so I did the only thing I thought I could do. This lady explained the situation to me. And first of all, I'm in stunned shock because I can't believe it. Who would do that to somebody? And then after you overcome the anger, and I was really angry in those days, you got to figure out how to figure out the problem. And you learn how to do what the civil rights workers call do something with nothing often and win. And I called and I asked the clerk of the court, how do I file a suit? All my life, I've gone to men or women, and how do I do it? And I kind of got a reputation around the Delta for doing that. I would call up somebody, and say, look, how do I do this? And they would actually sit down and explain it to me. And so I got great advice and counsel from a lot of people just because they were curious that this young Black lawyer from Baltimore would come down here and he wants to file a lawsuit. And he asked me how. They send you books, that lawyers never read and stuff. I can't find a law library. Tom Morris told me the law library was upstairs on the second floor of the Bolivar County Courthouse next to the jail. If you talk to the sheriff, he'll let you in. It was little stuff like that I guess in one sense endeared me to people, even white people who couldn't believe I was that stupid, right? And this is the part of Atticus Finch that nobody talks about. Atticus was a white racist, and he had access. We didn't. But the advantage that perhaps I had was I had lived with white people in college and I had been trained by a white Jewish lawyer. I wasn't afraid to ask. And surprisingly, I would get answers. And so I asked for some help. And Stavis sat down and talked to me about it. And then he put me in touch with Rhonda Copeland, is a very famous feminist lawyer. This is right after Roe versus Wade. And she can't believe it either. He can't believe it. And so we're sitting there. And so just like when I was trained to be his clerk, he said, Vic, take a shot. Go ahead and draft a complaint. Then I had to find the form for a complaint, and I knew that I had to write this well because this guy was just as tough and mean in terms of the character of what had to be written. And I had learned that because my name was going on this piece of paper. Well, it took me about 2 weeks to draft a complaint. And when I got there, they went over it and they said it was good. And I was confident that I had really done it well. But you just don't know. And I made the mistake of filing the court, and Ben will explain this to you later, in the wrong division point. And the Northern District and Southern District are divided up in division points. And so as a consequence, instead of filing it in the Greenville division point, Ben, I filed it in Clarksdale. And I thought, I'm sitting there when I learned a mistake, and oh my God, my world's coming to an end. D, watch out, my US Marshals are coming to pick us up, And The next morning in terror, I called the clerk and she's laughing her ass off because it wasn't that important. They were just going to shift the papers to where it belonged. And so now I said, well, when is the judge going to hear the case? And then they really started laughing, and they explained that Judge William Cady is the judge who's going to hear the case. And I didn't know it at that time. It was just remarkable luck that we just happened to get one of the best judges in the United States to hear this case. A man who was a former defense lawyer, but was famous for his fairness and his ability to get to the point. And many of the lawyers that I would later come to know would always comment about how fortunate all of us were that practiced before Cady. Cady reviewed the complaint, and I got a call from his law clerk, Wayne Drinkwater, I think, or Art Charles Powers, or whoever it was. And the comment the judge made was the same thing that Davis had said when he heard of it. So we've never heard of a case like this. But we noticed that you filed a motion for a preliminary and permanent injunction. Mr. McTeer, I'm predisposed to set this case down for trial in about 3 weeks. You gonna be ready? And all of a sudden it comes crashing down on you. I don't know what I don't know. And so I call everybody and tell them what's going on. And everybody's stunned. And finally, I plead with the court to perhaps give us some time to do some discovery, and he agrees to that. So we filed the case, I believe it was in the middle of January of 1973, and we're scheduled for trial in March. Well, the long and short of the story is we get prepared. And back in those days, legal services had nothing but Black lawyers at the Greenwood office. And I didn't have any secretarial help. And I had persuaded a philanthropist in New York to pay me a salary for 2 years. And the good folk in Mount Bayou gave Dee Dee a job as a teacher's assistant. And so that's how we managed to survive. But I didn't have any money for expenses. I didn't have any money at all. So I had to figure out how to do that. And the philanthropists then put my money into North Mississippi Rural Legal Services as a not-for-profit. And the result was I got paid through them. And when I explained the problem to Johnny Walls, who had also joined me on the pleadings, and to Willie Baylor, who had joined me on the pleadings, and Lou Myers, who had joined us on the pleadings, and Ben will tell you who all these people are. I called Francis Stevens, who was then the director of the program. And Francis had agreed to everything about me not working for legal services, but getting paid through legal services. He agreed with Johnny that they could provide me access to their library and access to their secretarial staff. And that Johnny and the rest of them could also work on the case because they were qualified to do so. Mrs. Katie Mae Andrews obviously fit the program's criteria. And so then we started to work this case. And it was a remarkable experience. Perhaps I was part of the best law firm that I'd ever been a part of. And later, all of us, Willie, Bailey, and myself, we would go into practice together. Then you'll be surprised, other people who worked at that firm at that time included in legal services, Carver Randall, Ed Blackman,
yes,
David Lipman. He left maybe a year before I got there. And I mean, you're talking about some pretty heavyweight people who are all trying to struggle through. And April, the way this normally worked is, no one was like Ben. Legal services was not viewed as a career. You spent your 2 years there getting your experience, and then you moved on into private practice. Well, I didn't have that concept. All I wanted to do was civil rights law, and that's the reason why I didn't work there. And I had a license to practice law in Maryland because I passed the bar. I took it in January, excuse me, I'm sorry, in June, and I passed the bar and was admitted to practice in December, 2 weeks before this lady walks into my office and asks me to handle this case. So we realized that we were in real trouble when Judge Cady announced that he had never heard of a case like this and he wanted expert testimony. You know, so we're grabbing the mystic rules of the federal rules of civil procedure to find out what an expert is, right? It's that bad, right? And so finally we figured out expert and we can't find one. You know, half of the Black community is pissed off at us because a woman having a child out of wedlock didn't look so good, so favorably, even among Black folk, even though the rates of illegitimacy, if you will, that was the term used at the time, were 12 times the number of whites. Eventually, we would find out that white folk had different ways of handling these things. They'd have the baby sometimes and give them up for adoption. Black folk had the baby, kept it. That, in my view, was more honorable. But the long and short of the story was that we couldn't find an expert. And so we're all sitting in legal services in Johnson Street in this rickety building. It's just horrible what they made you work in. And we figured out that the defendants had listed a witness who we found was the expert in Brown versus Board of Education for the school board. And I had an idea, it just came out of nowhere. Damn, if they can get the expert for the school board, why can't we get the expert that Thurgood Marshall used? And we called him, and I'm blanking on his name, it'll come back to me. We called him and he said yes, he would testify. Well, that led to a whole bunch of people falling into the case who all volunteered their time. They all gave it up. And we didn't have a single woman. I thought that was so stupid. There was no woman who was going to testify, yet women would be the most adversely affected people by the operation of a rule that says that, if you're pregnant and you choose to have your child, you can't work ever again. We're going to bar you from working. And, the equivalent of the far right press movement was just going wild about what this was going to do to poor white children who were going to be, forced to go into integrated schools. And the Attorney General of the state of Mississippi was putting out press releases about how immoral this situation was and how we had to do something about it for God, country, and America. We just couldn't find anybody, and I couldn't find a woman. And so we're having a fight among the young lawyers. We've just learned what an expert is now. We got to find one. And somebody said in the room, it's me, Willie, and Johnny, and I don't know who said it. I wish I could remember exactly what, but somebody said, if we had Fannie Lou Hamer, we could make this happen. We'd win this case. And somebody said, but Vic, she only has a 3rd grade education. I don't give a shit. If we could get Fannie Lou Hamer, we would make it happen, right? So I called Stavis and told him, I got an idea. We want to call Fannie Lou Hamer as an expert. You know what he says to me? But she's only got a 3rd grade education. How's she going to testify? I don't care. She's the most articulate person I've ever heard in my life. And she was legendary at that time. And so the one thing that came out of the case that I've always been proud of is I was a lawyer that called Fannie Lou Hamer as an expert to testify against some of the most brilliant minds in the right on an issue involving women's rights. And the fun part is Judge Cady listened to her testimony and agreed that she was an expert. It was spectacular. And The long and short of it is that the case that nobody thought we could win, the case that we got threats over, the very first case that I ever did, and did it with an all-Black team of young lawyers. Not a single one of them had any more experience than me. Matter of fact, I was the least experienced of all of them. And none of us had been more experienced than 3 years. And we faced the Attorney General of the state of Mississippi, and we faced the son-in-law, Senator Eastland, and the finest firms in Mississippi, and we won. Not just before Katie, not just before the Fifth Circuit, but in the United States Supreme Court in the case that I argued. It was a very, very important moment for me personally. And
Tell us again who those lawyers were.
For the other side?
No, you and your lawyers, your team.
All right, there was Johnny Walls, Willie Bailey, Lou Myers, Rhonda Copeland, who was the feminist lawyer from the Center for Constitutional Rights, Mort Stavis, Arthur Kanoy. I think that's all of them. There was another guy, but that was another case. I got to go to the Supreme Court twice, and this was the first time.
Thank you.
So it was legal services, did a wonderful job. Francis, I'll never forget it because he caught heat from all different places. And I never knew what Francis' role was, except for the fact that, he helped us finance everything and make it.
That's Francis Stevens.
Yeah.
He was executive director of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services at that time. Is that correct?
Right, that's correct. I understood that later, this case came up again and again at the time that legal services lawyers in the mid-70s were barred from handling civil rights litigation. Because remember, there were hair cases that kept up coming over and over again. Do you know what a hair case is, April? All right.
Not specifically.
The big hair, signs of blackness, what people of your generation would call critical race theory, say it loud, I'm proud, you know what I'm saying? Well, white school districts respond to that with the same kind of mental violence that they would utilize against freedom riders or students from Tougaloo who would dare to go to all white churches and demand entry, or people who would protest the violence that particularly in the 1963-64 period, the predecessors of Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman, and of Fannie Lou Hamer and June Johnson, who worked at legal services being beaten, or Larry Guillot being beaten in Winona, or that led to the reign of terror lawsuit, Kofo versus Rainey, which was filed by Stavis and Arthur Kanoy, or Dombrowski versus Pfister, which was the lawsuit that was filed by Kanoy, argued in the Supreme Court by Kanoy, that addressed the use of state power in order to kill free expression. And it's remarkable that so many of our younger people today don't know that, because it has a long-standing tradition growing out of white racism, intending to shut up what they don't want to hear. All of those cases come from a strong standing tradition that is based on poor folk. Because there are people in the elitists, if you will, white, sometimes Black civil rights community that say, you shouldn't go but so far. You don't tell that to Fannie Lou Hamer. You listen and you learn. And I have no doubt I was trained by the best. I was trained by white lawyers and Black lawyers who were taught to know their place, who were taught that it is not our job to tell our folk what their priorities are. It is their job to tell us. And every bit of success that I have supposedly had, and of the people that I have named to you already, who I know and understand that tradition, it all flows from two things. Number one, you cannot escape from the problems that we see when you live with the folk. And number two, you've got to do what they want, not what you want.
Mr. McTeer, you said her name was Miss Katie Mae Andrews, is that correct? What was the name of the case?
In the Supreme Court, it's the Drew Municipal Separate School District versus Katie Mae Andrews.
Okay, thank you.
And there were 3 other plaintiffs too in that case. I really wish that you could get Bailey. And the reason why is because so many of these young Black folk who put their lives on the line, like Bailey and like Griffin and like Ed Blackman, David Lipman, you know, are you there?
Yeah, and Griffin is Willie Griffin. Is that correct?
Right, yeah. And Robert Buck, Carver Randall, those people who stayed in their communities in the Delta, you know, they did so and did not choose to leave or did not choose to go to other places because they had to live with these realities on an ongoing basis. And they rarely get their props. They really are recognized for what they did and how they survived doing it. They didn't get a salary. When you're a private practice, you have to work and accommodate the needs and interests of your community. But so rarely do we talk about how that community gives back to you. And April, as you know, from my daughter's career, I will forever be grateful for what the community in the Mississippi Delta and elsewhere around the country where I was honored to work has done for our family.
What do you view as, let's say, impact of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services to the community, to North Mississippi Rural, or North Mississippi, as well as the state of Mississippi, and I'd say even beyond?
That's a really good question. And I want to respond first by saying, you got to remember now, my involvement with legal services continued through around 1983 or 84 with the county redistricting cases that took place at that time. So many of the people that you listed in the information that you provided to us did not, I wasn't part of that group when those folk were there. But the impact was immeasurable in terms of the fact that there were local or civil rights organizations that may have been based in Jackson, which provided immeasurable solace and relief to people who were suffering from endemic discrimination, ongoing discrimination. But the legal services lawyers, first of all, almost every one of them that I knew, you know, went on to practice law in the local communities that they served. So it was a training ground, first of all, for a number of young lawyers who would eventually move into the very communities and stay in the communities that they served, that they would become legislators, that they would become judges, and some of them would even become practitioners who regularly used the information and training they received in order to serve those communities, even until today. That kind of tradition and legacy is just immeasurable. It's so wonderful. And to the extent that they took the information that they learned there and passed it on to others, like Margaret Carey, who also worked with me, and other women who would themselves become judges and legislators. They have made a tremendous contribution, North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, that has been invaluable to the ongoing movement, the continuation of that movement, particularly affecting poor people.
Mr. McTeer, I just want to check in with your time. I'm okay personally to keep going. It's 12:04 here. I guess maybe 1:04 for you. Do you have a few more minutes?
Yeah, I really want to have Bailey join, and I see where he's called me again. Can you do me a favor?
Uh-huh.
I'm going to give you Bailey's number. I want you to call him.
Okay.
Okay, because obviously I'm not getting there.
Okay.
And his number is 662-335-1966.
What's the middle three numbers? 335?
5, yeah.
335.
I'm sorry, forgive me. 662-335-1966.
Okay. Okay. I'll do that and mute myself, but I wondered if while I do that, if you could talk a little bit more with Ben and Roy about other important cases that you worked on with NMRLS. Is that possible?
And Victor, Roy DeBerry, Dr. Roy DeBerry is I don't know, do you know Dr. DeBerry?
I remember him. I see his face now.
Yeah, yeah.
Can't hear him though.
Dr. DeBerry, you're muted. You're muted. Can you unmute?
Okay, what about now?
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Hey, I'm here in Jackson, so excuse me for coming in late, Ben. Also, I went to an office here with another computer that didn't have a camera, and that's why you couldn't pick me up. And that's why I went to the phone. But Dorian Turner, who is the attorney for my mental health commission, told me, I told her that I was going to sit in with you in April today, and Victor, to say hello, Victor. Dorian Turner here in Jackson.
Yeah, I remember her well. She, I believe, was representing the Greenville School District at some point.
She still does.
Really?
Yeah, she still does. She just lost her mother. Her mother just passed. Yeah, about 2 weeks ago, and so she's trying to get over that. But she's been our attorney here at the commission for about 20 years, and I tell you, she's a wonderful young lady. About 15 years.
Man, you shock me when you tell me that Dorian's been around for 20 years. Wow.
Yeah, it looked like it was just yesterday she went to, well, actually it's been about 15 years. I'm thinking about another attorney that was with her before she came, but because it looked like a few years when she and Carlton Reed went to University of Virginia. But yeah, I remember you, man. I followed you during the time I was in Jackson, had the utmost respect for the work that you guys had done. And I know people talk about the big cases involving tobacco, but y'all had done so much more long before those cases.
Well, I really appreciate hearing that from you, Roy. I remember from the good old days hearing so much about you, and I think we've met a couple of times in the past.
Yes, we have met. I'm delighted you mentioned Miss Hamer, because I'll tell you a short story before we continue. But I had an opportunity to meet Miss Hamer, and then I was with her. She was inside, I was outside. I was with Snick at the time as a youngster there in Holly Springs. And she met her there at the convention, where she gave that good speech. But she came out on that boardwalk, man, and would sing that wonderful song that she could sing, that only Fannie Lou Hamer could sing, as a way to keep us motivated as young people. I just had nothing but the greatest respect for that woman. I had a chance to go to her funeral as well.
Yeah. Well, Mrs. Hamer entrusted me and so many others to handling some of her affairs. And I thought it remarkable that this icon of the civil rights movement afforded me the opportunity to help train her in how to speak before a federal judge, who I would later find out had already picked her, Mrs. Hamer, to be an advisor for the court in a number of school desegregation cases. She was amazing. She really was.
Yeah.
And you know, when you meet her, she's awful powerful. Maybe one day I'll tell you about the first time she paid me for my legal work, but that's another thing.
Victor, let me ask you, were you ever involved in the Ayers case at all?
Yeah, I wrote the complaint. I wrote the complaint.
Okay, great. Could you tell us something about that case, your involvement in the case, and I guess maybe even just some other factors, maybe little known factors about the case that just give us a flavor for that.
There were, there was a group that was called the Black Mississippians Council on Higher Education.
Mm-hmm.
And that was, as I recall, that was one of the main plaintiffs in the case. And I was one of the people who was involved in that group. And Ike Madison and myself at the time were responsible for the drafting of the complaint, as I recall. And you may remember, Ben, I think you were around at that time, there were just meetings taking place all across the state.
Yeah.
And in Jackson, and I was in private practice. I think Ike, I'm not sure if he was in private practice or he was working for the Lawyers Committee, or he was about to leave working for the Lawyers Committee. I just don't know and don't recall.
I think he was about to leave, and then he was hired in the Greenville office to primarily continue working on the Ayers case.
Right. Well, again, I know that my name is, I'm one of the handwritten signatories, and I think Ike was the other in the case. I don't really remember who else was involved, but I do know about my involvement. And then right after we had the meeting of all the lawyers, in a complex litigation situation there, there's a grand meeting of all the lawyers sitting down and talking. And shortly after that, I left the case. And Ike then, as I understand it, took over himself. And I can't tell you what happened after that.
So were there other cases that you were involved with, maybe a co-counsel arrangement with legal service, North Mississippi Rural Legal Services during that time?
Hey, two of them that I know right offhand. There was a, let me make sure if I can get this right. It's a case named Graham versus Caston, which was filed maybe around 1973 again, involving, is a suit against the Federal Housing Administration and the Farmers Home Administration, charging them with failure to build housing for poor people in accordance with the federal minimal property standard. And we had a lady who came in to visit with me in Mount Bayou, averring that she had a brand new house, and that year had real bad rains in the Delta. And she had put her baby, one of her babies, in the tub on this federally approved or insured house that was supposed to be built in accordance with certain standards. And she found, after a few minutes, a baby was screaming and hollering, and she walked in the bathtub and it was full of sewage, the tub was. And the stuff had backed up, in part, allegedly, because of the fact that the sewer lines attached in the home were not of the proper size or construction, allegedly. The case was also filed, another case very similar to that one was also filed up in Shelby, a subdivision up in Shelby. And both cases were ultimately settled with repairs being made to those homes, and the federal government agreeing to enforce the rule of law in terms of the requirement that those homes be built in accordance with the federal minimum property standards. I am sure there were other cases, but 35, 40 years is a long time.
Right. And you mentioned Margaret Kibbe and
Carrie.
Harry.
Yeah. Margaret Kibbe was at Legal Services, however, when I was there, and as was June Johnson, which is somebody you didn't have on your list.
And that's where I was about to ask you about people who were non-lawyers that worked at North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, who maybe at some point became known as paralegals, but at some point community workers. Can you talk some about your knowledge about staff, especially the non-lawyer staff, and the contributions that they made to cases and the work of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services?
Well, certainly June Johnson was just spectacular. Macy Wooten was there, and she too. And this is where you really need Bailey, because the stories of their involvement were just absolutely incredible. And June was so important because of the fact that, did you ever meet June?
I worked with June.
Yeah.
Yes, I worked with June.
First of all, June was 6 feet 2 inches tall.
Right.
And if you got on her bad side, woo, she would come after you. She really would. And I had the penchant, of doing that. But once she figured out that, you were all right, you were cool.
Right.
And she was very protective, very protective. And I just never met anybody, outside of my mother, the two women who raised me, who was so strong. But, she and Miss Hamer had this kind of a fierceness. That's you tell me if I'm wrong. They were fierce.
Oh, yeah.
And activists. And, if you disagreed with them and they had good reason to believe that you just were taking the wrong position, first there was a kind of a sorrow of what, you were saying. And then it was as if, then they would let it rain on you.
And it didn't matter if you were an attorney.
Oh, hell no. Matter of fact, it was worse. It was worse, but I really learned a lot about respect from June and from Miss Hamer too. I learned that there was nothing wrong with being afraid. There's nothing wrong with getting knocked down. It's when you get up that you really show what you got and who you are. And getting up is much more important than getting knocked down too. So, that's another thing you learn when you live and work with poor folk. You spend a lot of time getting up.
Yeah.
A lot of time. And people who get a regular salary, or, people who maybe, feel that they know things that some folk, because of their demography, don't know. Sometimes they don't have that experience. I did.
Yeah. Okay, April, did you?
Ben, if I may.
Go ahead, Dr. Bear.
No, I don't know what y'all covered because I came in on the end, and of course, my whole thing was just sitting on the interview, and I enjoyed listening to you guys and listening to Victor. Recall the experiences of working in Mississippi during those very formative years. I guess the question I have: do you feel that you gain more from the people? You mentioned June, you mentioned Ms. Hamer, you mentioned others that. As I came in on the call, that you gain more from these people than they gain from you?
Oh, hell.
Your experience.
Of course. of course, not just me, but my family. And you know, it's they just don't deserve our thankfulness. You know, they deserve our respect. They deserve every measure of response and adulation for their courage. You know, it's funny, and I'm gonna say this to you, and you'll understand. I've talked to an amazing number of lawyers who all say the same thing, that they represented Mrs. Hamer. And I always laugh when I heard it because it's true. And the reason why is because just imagine if you were one of the most famous names in American history and you need some legal help. But sometimes lawyers don't get along with the clients. Sometimes they don't get along with each other. And sometimes, you know, they can be rather difficult. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And these people, though they may not have been formally educated, had to pick and choose who they wanted to represent them. And they did. And that's the reason why there's so many lawyers who represented Ms. Hamer. You know, one day you got picked, some days you didn't. And they were shrewd. They were so smart. And we never give them credit for it. And they know it. You know, anyone who purports to understand and know our community and doesn't know the history of Mount Bayou, doesn't know that, you know, Booker T. Washington regularly spoke there, doesn't know that sometimes in the summer, there would be 10,000 people that would gather for conferences in the 40s and 50s in Chocolate City, just to talk about economic development. You know, to not know that and to think you know our history is to ignore our history. And so for that reason, I was so fortunate to understand, I think, eventually, that there were people who were entitled to our respect, to my respect. And once I understood that, I think that community endeared itself to me and my family in a way that I never conceived could happen. You know, that's the reason why we believe in Black philanthropy. We believe in giving back, tithing to the Black community. And we've tried to do that over the years.
Fantastic. And so on that note, I appreciate the fact that Ben and his staff decided some time ago to do this project, to capture the stories that you are now telling today, because, and then I would hope that you also have published or will publish materials to get to this next generation that you have referenced. Because otherwise, as you say, there are people that don't know the story, will try to tell the story. Other people will ignore the story, and other people don't think the story has any relevance. So I think that's why this project that Ben is engaged in now during the last year with Jenny and others, it's just a wonderful testimony to trying to capture what you and so many other lawyers and people that have worked in this field, in this struggle, really, for all these years. Because a lot of people don't know the story. And so I'm just delighted to sit here today and listen to you and Ben and April, you know, dialogue, because there are things I've learned today I didn't know. And so these stories are important, and I'm glad to see you agreed to do this.
Well, thank you so much. And Roy and Ben, I want to tell you, you've got to talk to Willie Bailey. You've got to.
Yeah.
The stories that he tells as a native-born Mississippian, and now a state legislator, a 30-year practitioner of maybe 40 years now. I mean, they are invaluable to our recognition of the progress of our own, especially nowadays when we'll need unity, not just among each other, but among like-minded individuals to thwart a time that seems to be rushing upon us to return to some pretty dastardly situations that were common in the late 19th century.
Mhm.
Mr. McTeer, I did speak briefly with Mr. Bailey, and I think he was thrown off that the email came from my email and he didn't know who I was, and it had my Winter Institute contact information. So he was feeling a bit skeptical, I think, and he asked Ben, he asked if you will reach out to him to set up a time for an interview. And then Mr. McTeer, he said he looked forward to talking to you if you could call him later today.
I will.
Okay.
And I did write down the number, Victor, that you gave for him, and I'll reach out to him.
Okay, I appreciate that. Please do.
We will.
Because, you know, I have said this publicly in the past. I was so stupid when I first arrived in Mississippi that it's a wonder I'm still alive. And one of the wonders of why I'm still alive was Willie Bailey. He had to teach me how to walk down the Delta streets. And he wasn't alone. I'm just so happy that there were people there who were willing to help me get to wherever it is the hell I am. And I'll not forget that. Nor will my family.
I'm not sure how much time we got. April, are you got 2 or 3, 4 minutes?
Yeah.
Victor, you mentioned Judge Katie. I guess the luck of the draw to get Judge Katie on that case. Could you talk a little about Judge Katie and I think we think of him as being, at that time, he was being progressive as a judge in the state during that time. Could you talk a little bit about your perspective of Judge Katie and the cases, important cases that, especially North Mississippi Rural Legal Services brought, but the just civil rights cases that came before Judge Katie?
Katie handled any number of desegregation cases. He handled the case against the Mississippi Prison Defense, the prison community. He handled legislative redistricting. He trained a lot of lawyers. He really did. He is, I didn't tell you this part of the story, but you know, I got arrested by him during that first case. Actually brought me into chambers.
I did not know that.
Oh yeah. Something about somebody calling somebody by some foul name. You know, like I said, I was a lot angrier back then than I am now. But he also, he actually, he was very, very honorable in demanding and giving respect. And in his book, he said some nice things that I always will appreciate. But I think, and have always felt very fortunate that I, like many other young lawyers, had the opportunity to practice before him. And you may remember, Ben, there was also Orma Smith, a strange twosome for the Northern District of Mississippi, 2 judges known to adhere and follow the law. Mm-hmm. You know, neither one of these guys were wild crazy, wide-eyed liberals in any way, shape, or form.
Mhm.
But they did have a sense of the law as a vehicle of change in its formal application. I'll tell you one story and then I'm gonna leave it at that. When Katie found out that I did not have access to a law library in Greenville, he told me I'd come and use his library.
Mm.
And so I would come in, I'd get there like at about 6:30 or something, maybe 7. And he didn't get in until like 8:30. And sometimes he would just come over and sit down and talk, you know? And that's when it hit me that maybe I didn't want to be a judge. Because he was always eager to find out what was being said. You know, he would always talk and share information about the people of his generation. He gave me a book about the Great White Chief, the Mississippi governor, the first populist, and again, his name escapes me. I still have it, you know? And he had a wonderful way of sharing his interpretations in an ethical manner. And I would often share similar comments with him. And when I spoke at his memorial service, I told the story of how he had Buddy Wilson, his clerk, his marshal, come in after a particular explosive incident and haul me into his courtroom, and how he handled it, and how he used it as a teaching moment when he could have done something else. So, you know, my relationship with Katie has been documented as being personal and cordial. And I was honored to have practiced before him, and I'll leave it at that.
Mm.
And by the way, you know, you got some stars right now down in Jackson, one star in particular. And Carlton Reeves.
Oh yeah, I taught Carlton, by the way, at Jackson State. Quite a
Really?
guy.
Well, every time I read something he's written, I mean, gosh, he's wonderful. He really is. You all should be very proud. And
We are. We are.
very proud. So, you know, that being said, you know, I appreciate the time that you all have spent with me, and I'm begging you, I'm just absolutely begging you to try to talk with Willie.
We will.
Ellie, and just let him talk to you about his history and whatever he wants to and deems appropriate. I hope you'll talk to people like Margaret Carey, who, like me, are children of SNCC and COFO and of the Center for Constitutional Rights, the Freedom Riders, you know, Cheney, Schwerner, Goodman, of what I think is the most important event in Mississippi history, if not the South, the freedom vote of November of 1963, where 80-some thousand Black folk came out to vote to show and demonstrate that, you know, we want to vote when white folk were claiming we didn't.
If I may, on that note, Ben, for just another privilege here, since Victor mentioned the freedom vote, the book that I have, which is about Benton County, Voices from the Hill Country, we have a picture in which I gave to the publisher, and it's in the book, but it's a picture showing the wall-to-wall crowd there in Benton County at the church at the freedom vote.
Mhm.
And so just to his point about how relevant that period was and what the attendance looked like and how important people took that. So Victor, you're right on time with that. And we did capture that picture, at least in one place, and it's in the book, Voices from the Hill Country, which we did last summer.
Yeah.
Thank you for that point.
Okay. Well, we certainly do appreciate your time, Victor, and all the information you've given us. And just want to thank you.
It's mutual. Thank you.
Well, I've enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing and hearing it, whatever it is you're doing. I don't know if I've gotten everything recorded, but I certainly appreciate you all asking.
Okay. And
Thank you so
certainly,
much.
Ben, if I may say that there may be some time as we move further in this process, we could ask Victor if we need to do some follow-up. You know, one of the things I found out about oral history is that sometimes you miss something that's really important. You think about it later. The permission to go back and do a very short, edit if possible in the future.
Well, let me just say that, I have been trying to work on something in writing about some of the things I've said. It's taken me a long time to learn some of the things that I've shared with you, but there is no control that any one person or two people ought to have on our history. History is meant to be shared, as we all now know, now that we have people in power who manipulate facts in such a way that they not only degrade themselves, but they degrade the nature of the American dream to a one race, one demographic group, one sex reality. And that's just not true. I don't know if, April, if you've seen this, but there have been of late some wonderful work by indigenous people on American history and their view of it.
Yes.
And the idea of critical race theory being objectively deniable or objectively ignored is a product of people who just don't want to hear what we have to say. And the Tennessee legislature, the Texas legislature, the Georgia legislature, and other red state legislatures are going to be threatening the very essence of the First Amendment when they deny public institutions the opportunity to teach these accurate, in my view, views of systemic racism in America, systemic sexism, and other unfair biases that are corralled under the term white preference. So I share this information with you with those thoughts in mind. I have no monopoly on these facts. As a matter of fact, the people of color that I've spent time with have always decried the fact that no one speaks out for them. And my goal, as I start to now write, will be to speak loudly, because it ain't about me, it's about what they did for us.
Thank you.
thank you again. And certainly appreciate your time. And if we do need to follow up with you, we'll get in contact with you. And certainly as we edit and put together the videos, we will certainly share that with you. And certainly appreciate your input and any additional input you might be able to share with us. So again, thank you, Victor.
Well,
Yes.
thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank you, Mr. McTeer. It's an honor.
Hi, everybody.
take care.
See you, Roy.